Hey everybody, it's me, Albatross, back for part 3 a little sooner than I said I would be. Well, my whole windshield is like a solid sheet of ice, so I kind of got to sit here in my car and wait for it to melt. But I might as well go ahead and try to finish this if I can, since I'm already late and all. Okay, where did we leave off? Right here, okay. Plaintiff also urges this court to consider his aberrant behavior on the night of December 20th, 1957, and his expert's diagnosis, attributing this behavior to ingestion of LSD. When deciding his motion for summary judgment on the issue of whether the CIA did, in fact, drug him. Meanwhile, defendant's cross motion for summary judgment raises the separate issue of whether plaintiff can prove causation, that his robbery attempt was caused by LSD and not alcohol or some other catalyst. The question of causation and the differing assessments offered by plaintiff and defendant's experts are thus discussed in detail in the sections that follow, and the court will not precapitulate them here. For present purposes, it suffices only to state that these diagnoses are themselves sufficiently divided in a manner that this court cannot resolve. In other words, they're all contradicting each other, and the court can't resolve it on their own. So, basically. In the context of cross motions for summary judgment, that they add little to the analysis at this stage, being because they're both literally are each deposition is contradicting each other. Their experts are contradicting each other. It's all contradicting itself, and the court's basically saying we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place here. We can't really, make determinations, like that when everyone's differing so much. In addition, plaintiff's expert reached his conclusion attributing plaintiff's robbery attempt to the ingestion of LSD in large degree because of the separate accusations and supporting evidence that plaintiff had been unwillingly administered that drug. Absent such allegations and background, and faced merely with a cold medical record, it seems unlikely that plaintiff's expert would have independently fixed upon LSD as the precise cause of plaintiff's actions, eliminating from consideration all other potential psychological factors. So they're basically saying that they don't understand why that Wayne Ritchie's expert is directly attributing it to LSD and no other causation. That's what they're saying. Thus, it is largely circular for plaintiff to attempt to buttress his allegation of CIA drugging with an expert assessment that itself draws heavily upon the same allegation. Plaintiff's expert, various reports heavily reference Ritchie's allegation from this action. And this is a statement coming from Wayne Ritchie's expert. Turning to Mr. Ritchie's belief that he was drugged with LSD by the CIA, this is not an idle fantasy or a delusion lacking real-world foundation. Indeed, as described further below, plaintiff's expert opines that Wayne Ritchie was under the influence of a pharmacological agent, not that he was specifically administered LSD. Unsurprisingly, plaintiff and defendant paint substantially different pictures of the events of December 20th, 1957. Pictures that incorporate both direct testimony and the opinions of experts writing 45 years after the fact. In light of these divergent perspectives, the opinions offered by each party's experts do not shed substantially new light on, nor force a substantial reevaluation of, the factual questions that existed in the first place. By consequence, the testimony of Ira Feldman remains the singularly salient source of evidence on this issue. So they're saying the only really hard evidence they got is Ira's inconsistencies in his interrogations, and that they can't necessarily go on either expert on either side simply because both experts are painting opposite pictures. And since that's the only real solid piece of evidence they got to go on, they're going to address that and how solid it actually is. Whatever else they may indicate, Feldman's disparate assertions certainly do not constitute such an overwhelming body of evidence that no reasonable juror could find other than Ritchie was an unwitting victim of CIA Subproject 42. In other words, that even that evidence that they've got isn't a guarantee that a jury is going to side with Ritchie, is what they're saying. The lack of a direct positive statement by Ira Feldman that he did in fact participate in, or at least knew of, Ritchie's drugging is most significant here. Without a clear categorical admission of involvement by Ira Feldman, it is simply impossible for this court to conclude that no reasonable juror could find against plaintiff. Under such circumstances, and in the absence of such evidence, summary judgment for plaintiff is improper. At the same time, however, Feldman's sideways assertions do raise at least a triable issue of fact on this question. Faced with Feldman's contradictions and the possibility that he may have truthfully, though unwittingly, inculpated himself, a reasonable jury would be capable of finding for plaintiff. Motions for summary judgment on fact issues such as these do not ask the court for its best judgment on the veracity of a claim. The court's only role is to eliminate issues of fact upon which there can be no reasonable disagreement. In other words, the court's job right now is to discern the facts from like disagreements. You know what I mean? If it's something that both parties are contradicting, they can't really present it as a fact, is what they're saying. Despite the vagaries of Feldman's responses and his repeated, unequivocal denials of involvement, this is an issue about which reasonable jurors might well disagree. The court hereby denies both plaintiffs' and defendants' motions for partial summary judgment on the issue of whether Wayne Ritchie was an unwitting victim of CIA Subproject 42. So they're not closing the case. They're just denying their motions for summary judgment. You see, a summary judgment is basically it's kind of like a motion that you can file saying, look, with all the evidence that we got, we might as well just have a summary judgment because it's just too much evidence. And both sides are filing it on their own behalfs, but their evidence are contradicting each other and all that other stuff. So the court's not going to do their motion for summary judgments. And at the same time, they can see how Wayne Ritchie could possibly win this case. So they're going to send it to court. They're not going to do a summary judgment for either. They're going to send it to court. Okay. Then they go into a little more detail. Now they're going to address the causation, the LSD causation. Defendant has moved for summary judgment on the issue of whether plaintiff has adduced sufficient evidence to present a triable issue of fact regarding the question of whether his behavior on the night of December 20th, 1957 was in fact due to the ingestion of LSD. So basically they're saying that the defendant can't prove that his behavior was caused by LSD if he was in fact given LSD. Both sides agree that plaintiff suffered a brief psychotic episode that night that resulted in his attempted robbery of the Shady Grove bar. And a quote from Ketchum, which is the plaintiff, Wayne Ritchie's expert, from his report, Dr. Ketchum, he says, "It is certainly appropriate to regard Wayne's episode as a temporary psychotic disorder." Defendant has introduced the declarations of two psychiatric experts, Dr. Kenneth and... Wait, it looks like there's three of them. Dr. Kenneth, Dr. Gottlieb, and Dr. Abraham. I'm a little confused. Well, wait a minute. Gottlieb is dead at this point, so I don't think they actually mean him. I could be wrong. But anyways, the defendant has two experts. Wayne Ritchie has one expert. And both of the defendant's experts, both of whom their opinion is that plaintiff's actions and symptoms were more likely caused by the alcohol he ingested than by any potential doping with LSD. Plaintiff relies upon the declaration of Dr. James Ketchum, which is his one expert, which is another psychiatric expert. And he argues that Ritchie's psychotic episode was most likely caused by LSD rather than by alcohol. In part because Ketchum does not believe that Ritchie would have been substantially affected either on a short or long-term basis by the alcohol he did consume. This case is made particularly difficult by the more than 40 years that elapsed between Ritchie's psychotic episode and the psychiatric examinations used here to provide proof of causation, or lack thereof. Nevertheless, so they're saying that they think too much time has elapsed between this court hearing and the actual incident that occurred for any expert to give a proper opinion. Nevertheless, the court can only proceed with the evidence before it and weigh it carefully, considering the length of time that has passed. Okay, and Dr. Abraham, which is the defendant's expert, conducted a psychiatric examination of plaintiff, which is Wayne Ritchie, in March of 2003. Dr. Gottlieb never examined plaintiff personally. Okay, they clear that up here. Dr. Gottlieb was one of the main doctors in MK Ultra. And at this hearing, at this point, he's dead, and he never personally examined his plaintiff. He relied solely upon the written record in this case and the videotape of Dr. Abraham's examination. So, yeah, they're saying that Dr. Gottlieb may have an opinion about all of this, but he never actually examined Ritchie, and I think at this point he's dead, and he couldn't. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure Dr. Gottlieb is dead at this point in 2003. This case 2004. Pretty sure. I could be wrong, though. I could be wrong. Okay, now the defendant. The defendant's principal proffered facts. Defendant's motion for summary judgment centers on the claim that Ritchie's behavior was caused by both his near-term and long-term drinking. Ritchie was, by all accounts, a regular and occasionally heavy drinker. Yeah, but had he ever robbed a bar before this point? The plaintiff admits a past history of the excessive consumption of alcohol. The plaintiff qualifies on the Michigan Alcohol Screening Test Scale as a problem drinker, at least during the years 1949 through 1957. So they're going by one scale through one time period, saying he was a problem drinker. 3 separate times within the years preceding 1957, Ritchie had consumed as many as 15 to 25 drinks during one evening. According to who? Who's saying this? Wayne Ritchie or the defendant? Ketchum replied to Abraham report on Friday, December 20th, 1957. Ritchie, okay, now they're talking about the night in question. Ritchie consumed approximately 8 bourbon and sodas, beginning around noon at the Christmas party in the post office building and ending that evening at approximately 9 p.m. So yeah, between 12 to 9, he had 8 drinks, which at first sounds like a lot, but within a 9-hour span, that's more than enough time for your body to digest that alcohol. I'm not saying you're sober, but you know what I mean? You're not piss on the ground drunk. 1 drink per hour, your body, anywho, so yeah, okay, next page. The majority of this drinking occurred between, they're saying the majority of it occurred between 2 to 3:15 upon Ritchie's second visit to the Christmas party, and then he consumed 3 to 4 bourbons. So, okay, they're saying most of his drinks he consumed between 2 o'clock and 3:15. Which probably, definitely would have made him drunk. But the robbery didn't occur until later, I don't think. Let's keep reading. I'm not really sure. Dr. Gottlieb bases his conclusion that Ritchie could not have been drugged with LSD on 2 principal factors. First, he notes that Ritchie did not seem to display the indica of one who had been administered such a hallucinogen. He did not hallucinate. Oh, okay, so that's why he wasn't given it, because he did not hallucinate. He did not experience excess sweating, blurred vision, shaking, or loss of coordination. Well, how does Dr. Gottlieb know if he didn't examine him personally? How did he know? And there is no mention of Ritchie having dilated pupils. Okay, there's no mention of it, meaning just because they didn't mention it, meaning he didn't have it. Okay, Dr. Gottlieb, whatever you say. All of these are regularly documented symptoms of LSD use. In addition, Dr. Gottlieb notes that the plaintiff does not describe psychiatric afflictions characteristic of the post-LSD period. In sum, Dr. Gottlieb concludes the plaintiff describes virtually none of the classical mental or physical features of the acute drug state. I personally beg to differ, Dr. Gottlieb, but I guess you're the expert here. Second, Dr. Gottlieb claims that an LSD victim would not normally be capable of formulating a plan to commit robbery, including taking the necessary predicate steps as Ritchie did. Gottlieb writes that the planning and execution of a robbery, even a failed one, requires far more executive mental function than LSD ordinarily permits. I also disagree with that. But I'm going to keep reading. It is worth noting that Gottlieb does not claim to be offering a medical opinion that Ritchie was not given any LSD on the 20th of December. He believes simply that Ritchie cannot have been under the influence of LSD when he attempted to commit the armed robbery. Okay, and then they refer to the questions of the questioner. Doctor, have you expressed an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that Mr. Ritchie did not have any LSD on December 20th, 1957? And Dr. Gottlieb answers was no. Dr. Gottlieb also does not deny that LSD is a powerful narcotic or that it may produce bizarre behavior in those who ingest it. And according to Dr. Gottlieb, LSD can make people very, very crazy. According to Dr. Gottlieb. I don't know, a deputy U.S. Marshal holding up a bar sounds a bit crazy to me. Does it sound crazy to you all? Especially someone who, never gotten in trouble before at this point or anything, who had been, according to them, a problem drinker before this point. But up until this point, he had never threatened to harm anybody. But I continue. Okay, rather, according to Dr. Gottlieb, the plaintiff's behavior is quite consistent with numerous studies in the literature associating the use of alcohol with crime. Interestingly, Dr. Gottlieb does not claim that Ritchie was actually drunk in the classical sense of the word. Dr. Gottlieb stated during his deposition that Ritchie wasn't behaving in a drunk manner at all. Instead, Gottlieb's opinion opines that the condition from which Mr. Ritchie suffered was a psychotic state induced by alcohol. In the old days, it would be called alcoholic hallucinosis. It is not related to being intoxicated with alcohol. It is associated with chronic alcohol ingestion that is not connected with alcohol intoxication. In other words, he's saying that someone who has been drinking for long periods, suffers from chronic alcoholism and things like that, will eventually start hallucinating, not necessarily because they're intoxicated, but because of the long-standing dependency on alcohol. That's what I got from his assertions. Dr. Gottlieb thus does not rely upon the number of drinks that Ritchie consumed on that night as the causal factor for his behavior, but instead attempts to link Ritchie's actions to his long-standing consumption of alcohol, saying that it was due to him being a chronic alcoholic, not necessarily because he was super drunk that night. But that also doesn't really make much sense because he's a respected marshal. I don't know. Okay, in much the same fashion, defendant's second expert, Dr. Abraham, opines that Wayne Ritchie could not possibly have been under the influence of LSD at the time of his robbery, because he did not display any of the typical physical indications of an individual who has consumed that drug. But, doesn't everybody react differently, Dr. Abraham, to every drug? You're saying that everyone acts the same? Dr. Abraham conducted a psychiatric examination on March 31st, 2003 at the United States Attorney's Office in San Francisco and formed his opinions based on his analysis of Ritchie in that forum. Abraham's conclusions are relatively straightforward, and then we get into the defendant's, the United States expert, Dr. Abraham's conclusions here. And he again kind of mentions the same thing that Dr. Gottlieb said, but at least he actually did, do an examination, even if it was 40 years later. Okay. He said, physically, there's no report of bodily changes characteristic of LSD. There's no mention of dilated pupils made by anyone at any time, including a physician treating him for a head injury later that night. The plaintiff described some palpitations, but there was no excess sweating. No blurring of vision, shaking, or loss of coordination, as he shared with me. He shared with him, I didn't spill any drinks at all. Oh, okay, so he didn't spill any drinks, so that means he wasn't on LSD, is what Dr. Abraham is saying. In the ensuing years, the plaintiff does not describe psychiatric afflictions characteristic of the post-LSD period. That is, he described no recurrent perceptual flashbacks, suggesting hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, such as trailing imagery or protracted after imagery commonly seen following the use of LSD. So they're saying that it's common for people who, after they use LSD, to have like post symptoms of it. But even though they later admit that they didn't do any follow-ups with any of the people they tested. So I'm not sure how they came to that conclusion, because they never did any follow-ups with any of their subjects. So it's a little confusing. They don't really clear that up. Instead, Dr. Abraham believes that plaintiff is suffering from delusions brought on through a combination of his drinking and various of his personality traits. But he's a deputy marshal. Don't you guys give them psychiatric evaluations first? But I digress. Including a hypersensitivity or even an imagined sense of rejection. Dr. Abraham adds that these traits are consistent with a mixed personality disorder, with features of the avoidant, paranoid, and obsessive types. Well, wait a minute. Aren't those symptoms of LSD? But now you're saying it's a personality disorder. More to the point, they are likely to have been predisposing factors that led to the brief psychotic reaction the plaintiff appears to have suffered under the influence of a large amount of alcohol. I don't know, it kind of sounds contradictory to me. But we're about to find out what the other experts say. Let's see what they have to say. And Dr. Ketchum, which is Wayne Ritchie's expert, puts them all in their place. Plaintiff's expert, Dr. Ketchum, makes a number of points by way of response to defendant's expert's contentions. Yeah, he puts them in their place. Ketchum performed a so-called differential diagnosis upon Ritchie, in which he believes he successfully disaggregated the various potential causal factors behind Ritchie's episode on December 20th, 1957. Dr. Ketchum concludes that only LSD, not the alcohol Ritchie consumed or any underlying neurological cause or disease, can explain the events of that evening. Well, I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with being so conclusive on that. I feel like he could have worded it a little differently. Like maybe saying, like, considering, like, the circumstances or something. I don't know. I feel like, he could have worded that a little better, but I continue. He still puts them in their place. The only plausible explanation for the mental and emotional changes accompanied by the bizarre behavior shown by Mr. Ritchie on the day of his arrest is the ingestion of a pharmacological agent. For Dr. Ketchum, foremost within his argument, is the claim that Ritchie could not have been seriously intoxicated by the time he attempted to commit the robbery around 9 p.m. Okay, yeah. So he didn't commit the robbery until around 9 p.m. By that time, most of the alcohol would have, processed. According to their time of, according to their timeline and the amount of drinks he drank. Since Ritchie had only 8 drinks in a period of 9 hours, like I just said earlier, Ketchum estimates that his blood alcohol content would have been approximately 20 milligram percentage. Well below the legal limit and far too low to produce this entire scenario. of incapacitation and robbery. Ketchum's reply to Abraham's response notes, pharmacological studies of healthy non-alcoholic volunteers have demonstrated that this amount of alcohol is almost completely metabolized within such a time period. Ketchum evidently provides this fact not because it carries any legal significance, but merely as a useful metric for describing in commonly understood terms Ritchie's level of intoxication. So they're saying he's not using it as evidence or anything. He's just trying to portray that it's not, that they also can't conclude that alcohol was the cause because of the time elapsed and the amount of drinks. Okay. Ketchum also rejects the theory that Ritchie suffered from the type of long-term alcohol-induced psychosis that Dr. Gottlieb credits with causing this incident. Ketchum believes, and he quotes, "The effects of alcohol alone do not explain the perceptual distortions, paranoid delusions, depression, poor judgment, and loss of reality testing, nor the attempted commission of neologically conceived, ineptly executed criminal act." Explains Ketchum further. Alcohol-induced psychosis is associated with a prolonged period of heavy drinking and generally persists for days or weeks if untreated. Ritchie's case, argues Ketchum, fulfills neither of these conditions. And Ketchum argues there is nothing to suggest a significant alcohol problem in his pre-1957 history, nor any indication that any of his colleagues or supervisors considered him to be a problem drinker. Rather than attributing Ritchie's actions to alcohol, Ketchum argues that Ritchie's behavior is entirely consistent with what might be expected of someone who had been dosed with LSD, particularly given the variability in effects that different doses administered under different conditions can produce. In other words, he's saying you can't just go by one definition of how someone acts on LSD, being that depending on the dosage, people act differently depending on how much they're given, is what Ketchum is saying. Noting that the dose of LSD is unknown in this case. And Ketchum remarks that doses as small as 30 to 50 micrograms, I think is what that unit is, which may produce no outward signs, can cause marked disturbances in thinking and emotion. Dr. Ketchum also links Ritchie's ever-increasing paranoia on the night of December 20th to ingestion of LSD. And quote from Dr. Ketchum, "This type of expanding delusion is characteristic of LSD effects. Once a paranoid line of thought occurs under the influence of LSD, everything else seems to corroborate it." Ritchie claims that the driving motivation behind his commission of the robbery was his belief that everyone, quote, was against him, including his fellow officers, co-workers across the hall, and even people at the bars he visited. This paranoia only increased as the night progressed. Ketchum also disputes defendant's contention that an individual under the influence of LSD would be incapable of formulating the type of plan involving several coordinate steps. Yeah, I agree with that too, Dr. Ketchum. I agree with that too. That Ritchie had concocted to rob the bar at which he was eventually arrested. Ketchum notes that his experience with LSD patients and his perception of them does not comport with Dr. Abraham's impression that they would be unlikely to commit such a crime. And Dr. Ketchum goes on to say, "A tongue-tied, blissed-out, passive state is certainly not typical of what I have observed in almost 100 volunteers and dozens of Haight-Ashbury patients in 1967 to 68. Most of whom went through a range of emotions and frequently were paranoid at times." Finally, Ketchum takes issue with the subsequent takes issue with the significance that Dr. Abraham attaches to Ritchie's supposed lack of flashbacks subsequent to his alleged experience with LSD. So, in other words, he's saying that he also has an issue with Dr. Abraham saying that because he didn't have flashbacks, meaning he wasn't on LSD. He takes issue with that. Dr. Ketchum argues that first that Ritchie did have flashbacks in the sense that a vivid reliving of the criminal behavior would suddenly occur unexpectedly while in the grocery store, painting, etc. More to the point, Ketchum would not consider it surprising, even if Ritchie were not subject to flashbacks, since one study has reported from a large meta-analysis that most of those who have taken LSD do not report significant flashbacks, and if they do, they usually occur only for a few days or weeks. And now we're at the evaluation of the differing claims. Defendant urges this court to grant summary judgment on the issue of whether LSD caused Ritchie's psychotic episode, arguing that the testimony of plaintiff's expert, meaning Dr. Ketchum, when compared with that of defendant's experts, Dr. Abraham and I can't remember the other guy, does not create a substantial issue of material fact. Upon consideration of all available evidence, this question devolves into a form both familiar to and intractable for the courts. So they're saying, this is typical for the court. The cliched battle of the experts, adding to the traditional difficulties in analyzing expert testimony that attend any case in which experts play a significant role, is the nature of the evidence presented here. Plaintiff and defendant's experts are examining Ritchie more than 45 years after the events, which gave rise to this action. And yeah, that's true. That is true. That does make it a little difficult. All right. Oops. Well, okay, there we go. By consequence, they are forced to rely in large part upon their experience in dealing with similar patients, some of whom may have ingested alcohol or LSD in previous situations. Dr. Abraham, noting that plaintiff's behavior on the night of December 20th, 1957, does not conform to the mental state... Oh, wait, I'm sorry, this is Ketchum's. To the mental state of a tongue-tied, blissed-out, passive LSD cases I have observed in the last 30 years. Referencing his work with 100 LSD ingesting volunteers and patients in a San Francisco clinic over 30 years ago. Moreover, they must draw conclusions based upon analogies between plaintiff statements and a very limited knowledge foundation. There is hardly a plentiful public record of medical studies of LSD effects on humans. Yeah, because they destroyed them all. And nothing approaching medical consensus on the relevant issues. Yeah, they destroyed them all. That's why they can't. But anyway. This confluence of medical difficulties has rendered the experts unable to engage one another at the type of logical level that might enable this court to resolve the relevant issues on summary judgment. The parties' experts seem to lack the type of common experiences that might place their diagnoses on congruent planes. Rather, they appear largely to talk past one another. It is difficult to quarrel with an expert who states that in his, quote, extensive experience, his patients have generally behaved in a certain manner. An argument from general experience cannot be conclusively rebutted by more of the same. So they're saying that, they can't confirm or deny these arguments. That's what they're saying. Furthermore, plaintiff's experts' reasoning simply does not contain any prominent dispositive logical gaps that the defendant's experts can exploit. Oh, okay, I see. They're saying that, Dr. Ketchum's reasons are so, good that the defendants couldn't fairly argue against it. That's what it sounds like they're saying to me, personally. Dr. Ketchum has come to a well-reasoned, coherent conclusion. One that defendants' experts reasonably dispute, to be sure, but one that is not plainly incorrect or misinformed. It is not the role of this court, upon a motion for summary judgment, to pick between these competing experts. That task is left to the fact finder at trial. It remains only for this court to ascertain whether a reasonable jury could find for plaintiff on the issue of causation, given the evidence presented. And on that account, the court is satisfied that the plaintiff's expert has made a sufficient showing to enable a reasonable jury to hold in its favor. And in the conclusion, for the reasons stated above, the court denies plaintiff's motion in its entirety and denies defendant's motion in its entirety. So it is ordered. So, they're saying they're not giving their motion for summary judgment. Neither one of them. They're both going to have to go to court and fight it out because their experts are arguing with each other and all this other stuff. But the plaintiff's expert does give a good reason for it to continue. So, that's what they're saying. And to spoil it all for you, Wayne Ritchie ends up losing this case. I'm going to spoil it for you. I'm sorry. But he loses the case based on the Tort Act, which is basically saying that, someone who is in the military can't sue the government for things that occurred in line of duty, basically. I briefly talked about this act before, but that's basically why this whole case was, let go. I believe in 2009 or 2010. But, so yeah, they end up denying it all, and Wayne Ritchie gets nothing. And the government gets away with it, as usual. Ira Feldman never got in trouble. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb never got in trouble. Dr. Richard Helms never got in trouble for destroying all this evidence. None of them ever got in trouble. None of them. And none of the victims ever got justice. And it's going on to this day. It's just madness to me. It really is. That when you're suing the government, you gotta trust, in these situations, you gotta, I don't know, it's a conflict of interest, in my opinion. I don't know how to resolve that conflict of interest, but, when you got a judge that works for the government deciding on a case where you're fighting against the government, I don't know. It doesn't seem like a fair conclusion could ever be reached. Because, the judge works for the government. They're supposed to work for us, the citizens, but we all know that they don't. You know what I mean? We all know that. But anyways, that was that. I've got more cases I'm going to read later. I'm going to be posting the petitions later. There's going to be a lot coming up later today, so stay tuned. Oh, and like I said, I think I said this before I started this lawsuit, but if you were watching the All of Us documentary I had posted, I had to take it down because I got copyright strike by YouTube. I'm not sure why, because I thought that, I know it wasn't Allie. I know it wasn't her. It was whoever distributes this documentary, I guess, but whatever. Just let me know. I can bring it back up, but I'm gonna have to do commentary on it in order to not get copyright strike again. So if you guys want me to play it and do some commentary, I will. Or if you want to watch it without me interrupting and talking, you can always go to the YouTube channel God, Sex, and Love, and the other YouTube channel Risen from the Ashes, all one word. And I have both those links in my channel description. Okay, but that's it. Have a good day, everybody. Thanks. I'll see you guys later.